The first thing I saw was the hat, black felt, pulled low, the brim slicing his face into shadow and steel. My father had always worn his hats like armor, as though they could shield him from the world's cold stares. The steam from the waiting locomotive curled between us like a living thing, thick with the smell of iron and coal. My heart raced. After 10 years, I was finally going to see him again. My fingers tightened around the worn leather strap of my suitcase. Then he looked right through me, eyes fixed ahead, and walked past as if I were nothing more than smoke. I froze, the platform tilting beneath my feet. The sound of boots and heels striking the concrete echoed around me, but it all felt distant, muffled. I had imagined this moment so many times, him running to me, maybe pulling me into the kind of hug that erases lost years. Instead, his shoulder brushed mine without even a flicker of recognition. My breath caught in my throat, a sharp, painful knot I couldn't swallow. My father, my own blood, had just passed me like a stranger. For a moment, I told myself I'd made a mistake. Maybe it wasn't him. Maybe war had changed his face so much I'd imagined the familiar lines. But the limp in his left leg, the one from falling off the barn roof when I was 6, was there. The way he adjusted his cufflinks with 2 quick flicks before checking his watch was there. And the faint scent of his cologne, woodsy with a trace of tobacco, hung in the air between us like a ghost. I turned sharply, the hem of my coat brushing against my knees, and saw him moving through the crowd with steady, deliberate steps. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't avoiding anyone. He simply wasn't looking back. My legs moved before my mind caught up, weaving between porters and passengers, my suitcase bumping against my thigh. Every instinct screamed at me to call his name. But some part of me, the part that had lived through 10 years of silence, hesitated. The station itself seemed to hold its breath. Shafts of winter sunlight speared through the high glass windows, catching swirls of dust and steam. Somewhere far off, a whistle wailed, the kind that makes you think of all the places you could run to and never be found. My father reached the far platform, where a train stood waiting with its doors open. A tall woman in a dark coat appeared from the shadows and slipped her arm through his. She looked up at him with the kind of familiarity that made my stomach clench. He didn't flinch. He didn't look guilty. If anything, he seemed calmer with her there, as though my presence a moment ago had been nothing more than a ripple on the surface of a still pond. I stopped dead in my tracks, my pulse pounding in my ears. The woman said something and he nodded, the same slow, deliberate nod I'd seen 100 times when he was listening to my mother, and then they boarded together. The heavy train doors shut with a metallic finality that felt almost cruel. I stood there, staring at the spot where he'd vanished, my hands numb from the cold. A part of me wanted to collapse right there on the platform. Another part, the sharper, more dangerous part, wanted to know why. Why he had walked past me without a word. Why he was with her. Why after surviving everything he'd chosen to erase me from his world. The whistle screamed again, and the train began to move. I could have turned away, could have let him disappear for a second time, but as the wheels clattered against the rails, a single thought cut through the fog in my mind. If my father was pretending not to know me, it wasn't because he had forgotten. It was because he remembered and needed me to forget. The night after seeing him, I barely slept. My mind replayed the moment over and over, dissecting every detail. The slight twitch in his jaw, the way his hand had hovered near his coat pocket, the careful pace of his steps. It wasn't just that he didn't greet me. It was that he seemed prepared for me to be there, as if my presence had been anticipated, accounted for, and dismissed. That thought settled in my chest like ice. I tried to remember the last time I'd seen him before the war. It was late summer 1939. I'd been sitting on the fence by the orchard, legs swinging, when he walked up with his sleeves rolled and his hair damp from the river. He'd brought me a handful of wild raspberries and told me to eat them before the bees do. That was the sort of man my father was, rough, practical, but gentle in ways that mattered. When he left for work in the city that autumn, he promised he'd be home by Christmas. Christmas came, and he didn't. By spring, letters stopped coming. My mother kept setting an extra place at the table for months, then quietly stopped without saying a word. Neighbors whispered that he'd been conscripted, or that he'd been caught up in something political and disappeared. I was 12, too young to understand war and too old to believe in the lies adults tell children to keep them still. Every night I lay awake, listening for footsteps in the yard, waiting for the sound of his key in the door. The years that followed were heavy and slow. Rations, blackouts, and the muffled dread that came with every knock at the door. My mother grew smaller somehow, her voice quieter, her eyes distant. Once, during a particularly cold winter, she told me, "If your father comes back, it might not be the man you remember." I asked what she meant, but she just pressed her lips together and told me to finish my soup. After the war ended, people returned, thin, changed, haunted. But my father wasn't among them. We heard nothing. Not a letter, not a message. Then in 1948, a neighbor swore they'd seen him in a cafe near the docks speaking with a man in uniform. I rushed there that evening, but the place was empty, except for the smell of stale coffee and cigarette smoke. My mother's face when I told her was unreadable, a mixture of relief and something close to fear. In those years, I taught myself not to hope too loudly. Every time I imagined him stepping off a train, I forced myself to picture the worst first. A stranger, a man I couldn't recognize, a father who didn't remember me. Still, I couldn't erase the image of the raspberries in his palm, the way his rough fingers had always been careful when they touched my cheek. That image clung to me like a talisman, even when logic told me to let it go. Seeing him again at the station proved two things at once. He was alive, and he hadn't forgotten me. That should have been enough to fill the hollow in my chest. Instead, it deepened it, because if he remembered, then his silence was a choice. And choices always have reasons, the kind of reasons you can't outrun forever. 2 days after the station, I found myself back on the same platform, my breath clouding in the cold air. The city's morning rush moved around me like a current, people clutching suitcases and newspapers, their lives tangled in destinations I would never know. I wasn't here for a train, I was here for him. I told myself I only wanted answers, not a scene, not a fight. But my pulse betrayed me, drumming faster with every tick of the station clock. I had returned at the same hour I'd seen him before, betting that his routine was as precise as it had always been. My father was a man of habit. Meals at the same time, the same chair by the fire, the same route to work every day. Even as a child, I'd known I could find him by following his patterns. War might have broken the world, but I doubted it had broken that part of him. I scanned the crowd, watching for the black hat, and there it was, bobbing slightly above the sea of heads, moving with steady intent. My heart jerked, the way it does when you recognize a face in a dream you thought you'd forgotten. This time, he wasn't alone. The woman from before was with him again. Her coat was dark green, finely tailored, and her gloved hand rested lightly on his arm as though it belonged there. She had the kind of poise that comes from knowing you are seen. I started forward, weaving through the crowd until I was close enough to catch their voices over the din. He spoke first, his tone low but sharp, the way it had been when he wanted me to listen without arguing. "Not here," he said. The woman's reply was softer but urgent. She was looking right at you. My stomach knotted. There was no question who she was. They moved toward the far end of the platform, where the shadows pooled thick between the stone pillars. I followed, careful to keep enough distance that they wouldn't feel my breath on their backs. Every step closer built a tightness in my chest, equal parts fear and rage. I could almost hear my mother's voice. "Don't push him, Anna. You won't like what you find." Just when I thought I would reach them, he stopped abruptly and turned his head slightly. Not enough to meet my eyes, but enough to make me feel seen. It was a flicker, a glance over the shoulder, the barest acknowledgement. And then, as if he'd decided the risk was too great, he led the woman up the steps to the street, their pace quickening. The crowd swallowed them, and I was left standing in the exhaust of a departing train, my chance slipping away like steam. For a long moment I couldn't move. The station noise dulled, replaced by the roaring in my ears. He had seen me. He had heard her mention me. And still, he had chosen to walk away. That, I realized, was more deliberate than any silence could ever be. It wasn't just avoidance, it was protection, or betrayal. And I didn't yet know which was worse. I found it early the next morning. A thin envelope slipped halfway under my door, its edge curled where it had caught against the rug. No knock, no footsteps in the hall to warn me, just silence. My name was written in a firm, precise hand I knew by heart, a hand I'd traced with my own fingers as a child, copying his letters on scrap paper. My breath caught before I even picked it up. The paper was heavy, the kind you buy when you want words to matter. I closed the door, leaning against it for a moment before sliding a finger under the seal. The glue gave with a whisper, and inside was a single folded sheet. No return address, no date. I unfolded it slowly, my hands trembling despite the calm, measured script staring back at me. "Anna, do not follow me again. It is not safe for either of us." There are things you do not know, and must not know. This is not abandonment. It is the only way I can protect you. Trust me as you once did. Father. I read it 3 times before sitting down on the edge of the bed. My father's voice was in every word, clipped, controlled, deliberate. And yet, there was an urgency there too, a strain beneath the ink, as if every sentence had been pulled taut to keep from unraveling. Protection. That word lodged in my chest like a splinter. Protection from what? From whom? The irony wasn't lost on me. He'd spent a decade disappearing, only to reappear just long enough to tell me to stay away. But the letter also meant something else. He had been close enough to deliver it without waking me, close enough to stand outside my door, which meant he'd known where I lived, maybe for longer than I cared to think about. How many times had he stood there, deciding whether to knock? I tried to picture him in the hallway, the brim of his hat shadowing his eyes, the faint smell of pipe smoke clinging to his coat, one hand on the envelope, the other curled in a fist. My mind kept looping back to the green-coated woman. Was she the danger, or was she the reason he couldn't come back? I didn't like either possibility. The letter was meant to end my search. Instead, it sharpened it. I folded it carefully and tucked it into the lining of my coat close to my heart. If my father thought distance could protect me, he had underestimated the years I'd spent surviving without him. Whatever shadow he was living under, I intended to step into it. I began with the letter's paper. It wasn't the kind you bought at the corner shop. It was thicker, textured, the sort used in offices or official correspondence. There was a faint watermark when I held it up to the window, a crest I didn't recognize, 2 crossed keys beneath a crown. It was my first clue, and it led me to the old quarter, where the streets narrowed and the signs above the doors still bore faded gold leaf. The cafe was the sort of place where time seemed reluctant to pass. Smoky glass lamps hung low over worn tables, and the air was heavy with the smell of strong coffee and yesterday's cigarettes. I didn't come here by chance. A former neighbor of mine, one who had a habit of knowing things she shouldn't, had mentioned seeing my father here in the company of a man called Richter. She'd said it with a look that made me wonder if she regretted telling me at all. Richter was there when I arrived, sitting in the far corner, his chair tilted slightly so he could watch both the street outside and the room itself. He was thick-set, with hair gone silver at the temples, and a scar that cut from his left ear down to the hinge of his jaw. His eyes were the pale, cold blue of water under ice, and they fixed on me the moment I stepped inside. I knew without asking that he recognized me. I ordered a coffee I had no intention of drinking and slid into the seat opposite him. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said, "You have your mother's eyes, and your father's recklessness." My fingers tightened around the edge of the table. I told him I wanted to know where my father was. He smiled, but it wasn't kind. He's where he needs to be, which is not here. And if you care for him at all, you'll leave it that way. I asked about the letter. His expression barely shifted, but I caught it, the flicker of recognition. "Then he's already told you more than he should," Richter said, leaning back. "If you think this is about you, you're wrong. It's bigger. And once you're in it, you can't walk back out." He spoke with the certainty of someone who'd learned that truth the hard way. I pressed him for details, but he only offered a warning. There are people who will use you to get to him, people who'd prefer he was dead. When I asked who, he shook his head. "The less you know, the longer you live." He finished his coffee in one swallow, left a coin on the table, and walked out without looking back. I stayed seated long after he'd gone, the bitter coffee cooling in front of me. His words had the ring of a threat, but they also told me something he hadn't intended. My father was alive, involved in something dangerous, and there were others watching both of us. The shadow over his life wasn't just his to carry anymore. It had already reached me. It was raining when I left the cafe, the kind of rain that slicks the cobblestones and turns the city into a reflection of itself, dark, doubled, distorted. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see Richter there, or worse, my father. But the street was empty, except for the dripping awnings and the hiss of water in the gutters. I told myself the unease was just in my head until I reached my building. That's when I saw it, a single playing card, propped against my doorframe, the Queen of Spades. Its edges were wet from the rain, but the ink was still sharp. Someone had placed it there deliberately, not blown by the wind. I picked it up, the card slick against my fingers, and felt the weight of its meaning without fully understanding it. It wasn't random, it was a message. Inside, the air felt wrong, heavier somehow. I checked the locks. Nothing had been forced. Still, I moved from room to room, searching for signs of entry. That's when I found the second card, lying on my pillow, the Ace of Spades. It was dry, which meant whoever left it had been inside my apartment while I was at the cafe. My stomach tightened. They hadn't taken anything. They hadn't needed to. I thought of Richter's words. There are people who will use you to get to him. The cards weren't just a warning. They were a calling card, a promise that I was already under watch. I didn't know if it was from the people who wanted him dead or from my father himself. Either way, it was a signal. Stop now, or see how far this game can go. For a moment, I considered it. Closing the curtains, burning the letter, walking away from the station and the cafe and all of it, pretending like he had that we didn't know each other, but I'd lived with questions for 10 years, and the sight of him had set something alight in me that couldn't be smothered by fear. If the game had begun, I wasn't going to fold. I placed both cards in the same pocket where I'd been keeping the letter. Together, they felt like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't yet seen the picture of. Outside, the rain kept falling, drumming against the windows like a clock counting down. I didn't know to what, but I intended to be ready when it came. That night, sleep was a fragile thing, coming in brief snatches between creaks and shadows. Each time I woke, I thought I saw movement by the door, whether it was my imagination or something more I couldn't tell. By morning, I had made my choice. If they wanted to scare me, they'd have to try harder. I saw her again 3 days later, without my father this time. The green coat was unmistakable. Its deep emerald fabric seemed to pull the light toward it. The collar turned just enough to frame a face both elegant and sharp. She was standing outside a bookstore on Rue des Artisans, speaking quietly to the shopkeeper. I might have walked past her entirely if not for the way her gloved hand held the door, poised as though she were waiting for someone. I crossed the street, my heart thudding. Without my father beside her, she looked less guarded. She browsed the window display, glancing at her reflection as much as the books. When she finally went inside, I followed. The shop smelled of paper and dust, the kind that clings to old bindings. She drifted toward the back, her hand grazing spines like a pianist touching keys. I pretended to study a shelf nearby, stealing glances. Up close, she was younger than I'd thought. Early 40s, perhaps, though her poise made her seem older. There was something familiar about the curve of her jaw, the way her mouth tightened in thought. She chose a book, paid in cash, and left without speaking to me. Outside, I quickened my pace to catch her. "Excuse me," I said, my voice sounding steadier than I felt. She stopped, turning with a cool precision that made me feel as if she'd known I'd been following her all along. "Yes?" The single word was smooth, unhurried. "I've seen you with my father," I said. Her eyes, a striking grey flecked with green, flickered briefly. "And who?" she asked. "Would your father be?" I gave his name. She didn't react. Not in the way most people would upon hearing it. Instead, she studied me, gaze moving from my face to my hands, as if searching for proof. "You look like him," she said finally, her tone unreadable. "But you have her mouth." It took me a moment to realize who she meant. My mother. Before I could respond, she added, "You shouldn't be looking for him. It's not safe, for you or for him." "I keep hearing that," I said. "No one explains why." She tilted her head, almost smiling. "Because explanations get people killed." Then, without another word, she turned and disappeared into the flow of pedestrians, the green coat swallowed by the crowd. I stood there, the cold air biting at my cheeks, replaying her words. The familiarity I'd felt wasn't imagined. She knew my parents, possibly knew them better than I ever had, and yet there was no kindness in her warning, only inevitability, as if she already knew how this would end. It came to me in a manila envelope, no return address. I found it in my postbox 2 mornings after I'd seen the woman in the green coat. Inside was nothing but a single black and white photograph, creased and yellowing at the edges. It showed 5 people standing in front of a bombed-out building, their faces grim, the rubble piled high behind them. My father was in the center. He was younger, perhaps 30, but unmistakably him, the same square shoulders, the same steady gaze. To his left stood a man I didn't know, and to his right, the woman in the green coat, though then she wore a military uniform, the cap tilted at a defiant angle. Her arm was linked with his. My breath caught, not because of the uniform, but because of the way they stood together. It wasn't casual, it was close. In the far corner of the photograph was a date, scrawled in pencil, August 1944. That was the month Paris had been liberated. My mother had once told me my father spent that summer away on business, but she'd never said where. Looking at the photo, I wondered if she had even known. I turned it over. On the back, in the same precise handwriting as his letter, were 4 words: "Don't trust anyone else." It wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. The message was for me, and it was recent. The ink was still dark, the strokes sharp, which meant my father had not only sent it, but wanted me to know the green-coated woman was part of whatever history he was trying to keep hidden. Questions tumbled in my mind. Were they comrades? Lovers? Was she the reason he'd left us? And what about the others in the photo? Were they still alive, watching, waiting? My father's warnings had felt abstract until now, like smoke I could wave away. This picture was different. It was proof. I stared at his face, frozen in that moment of war, and realized I didn't recognize the man in it at all. He had been someone before he was my father, someone capable of things I might not understand, maybe even someone capable of walking past his own daughter in a train station without a flicker of recognition. But if this was meant to make me stop, it had the opposite effect. The photograph wasn't a barrier, it was a map pointing to a time and place where answers might still be found. And I intended to follow it, no matter where it led. The station felt different after dark. By day, it was a rush of noise and movement. By night, it was a cavern of echoes. Lamps cast long pools of yellow light on the platform, leaving the rest swallowed in shadow. The air smelled of cold metal and oil, and the sound of distant trains rumbled like distant thunder. I kept my coat collar turned up, my hands deep in my pockets, the photograph folded against my palm like a talisman. I had chosen this hour because it was when the last train to the border left. If my father was going anywhere, this would be the time. I waited near the far end, half hidden behind a pillar, my eyes scanning each passenger. The longer I stood there, the more certain I became that I wasn't alone. There's a weight to being watched. It sits between your shoulder blades, makes your skin itch. When I glanced toward the shadows near the ticket booth, I caught a flicker of movement. A figure stood there just beyond the light. I couldn't see the face, but I saw the shape of the coat. Green. My pulse quickened. She was leaning casually against the wall, as if she belonged there, but her gaze was fixed on me, not the crowd. Me. I forced myself to stay where I was. If I moved toward her, she might vanish again. If I moved away, I'd lose my vantage point. The train pulled in with a screech of brakes, steam curling around its wheels. Through the haze, I saw another figure step onto the platform, taller, wearing the black hat I knew too well. My father. The green-coated woman shifted then, her attention leaving me and snapping to him. She started forward, her pace deliberate. My father noticed her and froze for a heartbeat before turning sharply toward the train. He didn't run, but he moved quickly enough to make her push through the crowd. I stayed rooted, torn between following him or her. Then I felt it, a hand firm and cold on my shoulder. I spun ready to fight, but the man behind me wasn't a stranger. It was Richter. "Not here," he said, his voice low but urgent. "If you want to stay alive, walk with me, now." I glanced back, but the platform had shifted. Steam, bodies, shadows swallowing everything. My father was gone. So was the green coat. Richter's grip tightened. "You've just been seen by both sides," he said. "That's the last mistake you can afford to make." Richter didn't let go of my arm until we were in the back of a truck headed toward the border. The engine roared, drowning out the questions I kept trying to ask. He handed me a small flask, the metal cold against my palm. "Drink," he said. I didn't. "You're about to learn things you can't unlearn. It's easier if you're steady." We reached a checkpoint just before dawn. Beyond it lay the river, and the old ferry crossing no one used anymore. The mist was thick enough to hide shapes until they were almost on you. One of those shapes was my father. He stood near the water's edge, hands in his coat pockets, watching us approach. The sight of him here, after everything, felt unreal. When I called his name, he looked at me, really looked, for the first time in years. No pretense, no turning away. "Anna," he said quietly, as if tasting the word. He glanced at Richter. "You shouldn't have brought her." "She brought herself," Richter said. Then he walked away, leaving us in the fog. My father studied me, his face older, lined not just with age, but with choices. "You think I left because I didn't care," he said. "But I left because I cared too much. The war didn't end in 45, not for me, not for her." He handed me something, a worn leather folder. Inside were documents, names, photographs, including the one I'd received. "I worked for a network," he said. "We stopped men who should never have walked free. Your mother knew, she was part of it once. But when they came for her, I had to disappear to keep you safe." My throat tightened. And the woman in the green coat. His eyes darkened. "My handler and my jailer." She kept me alive, but not free. Now she's chosen a side, and it's not mine, which means it's not yours. The sound of a boat engine cut through the mist. My father pressed the folder into my hands. Once you take this, you'll be in it. They'll come after you, too. I thought of the cards, the warnings, the years of silence. I thought of how it felt to see him walk past me at the station, a stranger in his own daughter's eyes. I'm already in it, I said. His mouth curved, not a smile, but something close. The boat drew alongside the dock. He stepped back into the fog. Then remember, trust no one, not even me. And before I could answer, he was gone. The boatman gestured for me to climb aboard. The folder felt heavier than it should have, its weight pressing against my chest. Somewhere in the mist, I thought I saw a flicker of green. Then the engine roared, the river swallowed us, and the station, the last place I'd ever seen him, but it felt impossibly far away.